Good evening. How's everybody doing? Is everyone still like dripping sweat like I am? Yeah, it's kind of toasty out there. At least it wasn't like 90 like it was earlier today. It was only like 80 when we were out there, which is still, not too terribly cool, but it's all good. All right, so we're starting this brand new series all about the big questions because we believe that the biggest questions deserve the best answers. And oftentimes when we ask the deep questions, it's hard to get a straight answer. In fact, most of our questions are complicated in their answers, and it's difficult to find a correct answer. And if you try to Google it or YouTube it or TikTok it, then you're going to find a variety of answers that may or may not be good answers. And just to prove my point, I Googled, are blueberries healthy for you? And I got this response. So are blueberries good for you? And there's like, these are the top 3 results. Proven health benefits, health benefits and facts, 3 most powerful health benefits. But just to prove my point, when I Googled, are blueberries bad for you? This is what I got. Health risks of eating blueberries and strawberries. Why blueberries aren't really a superfood. And it's funny because it kind of proves the point that you can find whatever answer you want to find. If you want it to confirm your confirmation bias, if you want it to say something, then you can make it say something. You can make it say whatever you want to say. In fact, there's preachers that'll get up and make the Bible say whatever they want it to say. You guys heard people do that? Maybe it wasn't a preacher, but a friend of yours or another, like a parent, and they use the scripture to say something that it actually doesn't say because they took something out of context or whatever reason. All that to say, getting good answers to our big questions can be really difficult. Just like any information you get, you should cross-check it, you should double-check it, and you should verify the sources. How many of you guys are at the point in writing class where you have to write papers and put a bibliography at the bottom of it? Where you cite your sources? Anybody? You in that part of English class yet? Or in college, this was real big. We had to have X amount of sources, and we had to format it correctly. In fact, I would go to easybib.com to autofill the format because I still to this day can't figure out what format the bibliography is supposed to be in. And so, but you got to cite your sources. Wikipedia didn't count, and you had to find legit sources. And so the same is true when we come to the Bible. There's different things that we can do to verify the information that we're getting to see, an easy way to check for context. If you're reading something in the Bible and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense or it sounds out of place, read the chapter before it and the chapter after it, and then kind of look at, if you go to the Bible app on your phone, a lot of them will give a synopsis, a lot of the versions of the Bible will give a synopsis on what that book is about. So if you're reading the book of Hebrews and it says some really confusing stuff in it, you can find, we don't know the author, but we know he was Jewish and he was writing to a Jewish audience, and he was saying this about Christianity in light of the resurrection and why some of the old Jewish customs didn't make sense and why some of them did. And so you do a little research, you verify your sources, and you understand kind of where we're coming from, what the author intended to say back when he wrote it 2,000 years ago, and that can help us inform the meaning to us today. So there's a lot of big questions that Christians and non-Christians alike have when it comes to Jesus, faith, Christianity, and that's understandable because a lot of these big questions have complicated answers or not so complicated answers, but have lots of differing answers that you could find should you look for them. And so this whole series is going to be about I'm going to be walking you through some of the biggest questions as it relates to faith and identity and belonging. And in fact, some of the biggest questions that we'll be tackling on the broader sense, they're a little churchy, I'll admit, but we're going to get deeper. And if you've been following our social media and you know that our 5th through 8th graders are going through a similar series, actually it's the exact same series, it's called The Big Questions, it's different content for you than it is for them. The overall concepts are similar, but we're taking it deeper for you than we are for them because you guys are capable. And so just to give you that disclaimer, but we're going to be talking through things like the questions like, why am I here? Who are my people? And what am I supposed to do with my life? These are pretty big questions, and it's important to find good and satisfactory answers to those questions. And so that's what we're going to do in this series. And so to start off, I'm going to ask you a pretty churchy question that could have a lot of very different answers depending on where you look. The question is, what does it mean to follow Jesus? Now, if you've gone to church a long time, then you probably have an answer tucked away in your head somewhere. What does it mean to follow Jesus? Maybe you don't think about it consciously anymore because you're around it a lot. You're around like-minded people. You've gone to church for a while. You kind of get this idea of what it means to follow Jesus? If you're not around church very often, or if you didn't grow up around that, then that question could be a very legitimate question that has a lot of confusing answers to it. I've been a Christian my whole life, and that still has some complicated answers for my own life and application. So what does it mean to actually follow Jesus? And if you are on YouTube at all, and you're trying to figure this out, you get a lot of really weird answers really quick. In fact, sometimes it's not like explicitly said what following Jesus is, but you see all these Christian accounts or these people that follow Jesus and the things that they say, and it seems shallow, if I'm being honest. They talk a lot about, like, use this kind of Bible, or play this kind of music, or my real algorithm right now has been giving me a lot of end times stuff because of everything that's going on in the world that is completely out of context of what Revelation was actually saying. And so you can find a lot of stuff that will say pretty much anything. In fact, Chelsea and I were laying in bed a few months ago, and both of us were being on our phones and paying zero attention to each other, and we were both laughing at our own TikTok feeds. And I hear on her thing, we're in the end times. You can tell now because of the stuff going on in the Middle East, and because in the book of Revelation. And then I looked at her, and I just gave her this look. She's like, yeah, my algorithm's really screwy right now. It's giving me really wacky answers to Bible things. It's like, yeah, don't keep watching that, or it's going to keep showing you more of that. So you can be anywhere and get a lot of really weird answers, but it seems like people who are Christians on those accounts, whether it be, what you're searching on Google or on YouTube, or maybe it is TikTok or Reels, you hear things like, use this kind of Bible, play this kind of music, pray for 15 hours a week. Real Christians dress like this, talk like this, and spend their time like this. You guys heard stuff like this? And so it seems like to follow Jesus, you have to do all these things. It's this checklist that you have to do this, don't do this, make sure you don't say that, and make sure you talk about these things, and make sure you present yourself in a manner that is worthy of the company you are in, right? And it seems very, shallow, if we're being honest. But here's what's difficult. If we say that the answer to the question, what does it mean to follow Jesus, could change everything for us, but then the answers we find online are shallow, then why follow Jesus at all? If we know that, and you hear Christians say that following Jesus changes everything, but when people talk about following Jesus, it sounds shallow, then a very valid question is, why would I do that? If it's not going to affect my life, if it's not going to affect any change really, it's just a bunch of things to do or not do, then why follow at all? So it brings us back to this question, what does it really mean to follow Jesus? When I was your age, I had a pretty good idea of what it meant. When I was in college, I had a pretty good idea of what it meant. Today, I've got a pretty good idea of what it means. But I can tell you, in every stage of my life, my thinking has shifted a little, not because God's word changes, but because I'm growing and I become more mature. And I learn sometimes my thinking is wrong. Sometimes I have to shift my perspective. Sometimes I've been reading a passage of the Bible incorrectly, and I've been applying it wrong. And so then I have to go and work on myself a little bit. I've got to study up. And that really sounds a lot more difficult than it has to be, and sometimes we make it more difficult. Sometimes you'll hear preachers that intentionally obscure things or make things really detailed and complex to show off how smart they are, when in actuality it just discourages people from their faith. And so my goal with this series is not to get super complicated, but that doesn't mean we can't get deep. That doesn't mean we can't get to the bottom of what this means, or at least maybe start to scratch the surface of the depth of what it means to follow Jesus. So, this is a question that people have asked since the beginning of time, really. What does it mean to follow God? And then, all kinds of cultures have had many gods in different parts of the world now. There's still that going on. Some religions have one God. In fact, a lot of people claim that the God of Islam and Mormonism and Christianity and Jehovah's Witnesses and Judaism is all the same God. And if we're reading our Bible, then we don't get that answer. But there is this obscurity of what does it mean to follow Jesus. In fact, ever since Jesus rose from the dead and his earliest disciples in the early church, people were asking this question, okay, so what does it really mean to follow Jesus? In a few weeks, we're going to talk about some of the stuff Paul did and the way he ministered to people and the message that he had for people. And you'll find there was a lot of racism in the early church. The Jews were like, no, this message isn't for non-Jews. This is for us, because we grew up doing these things. And Paul comes along and he's like, no, that's not why. And Paul was Jewish. And so Christianity has always been for anybody, but my point is that people have been asking, what does it mean to follow Jesus? What things do I have to do? What things do I have to not do? And so what does this actually look like on a practical level? So what I want to do is take you back to the very, very beginning of some of Jesus' first followers. And so if we read in the Gospel of Matthew, written by Matthew, the tax collector at the time, and we find out what happened. One day, Jesus, as he was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. And Jesus called out to them, "Come and follow me. I will show you how to fish for people." And they left their nets at once and followed him. Now, that seems a little weird. We gather from other accounts, there was some miracle stuff that happened because Jesus told them, cast your nets on the other side of the boat after they'd been fishing all night and caught nothing. And these are like professional fishermen, like, what does this guy know? Right, fine, whatever, I'll entertain you. So they do it, and then their boats overflow with all the fish that they catch, and they realize he just performed a miracle. And so that's a little more compelling evidence to drop what they're doing and follow him. But what you need to understand in this day and age and in this culture, there were lots of religious leaders that had disciples, and it was not uncommon for one to find a worthy student and say, "Come follow me." The difference was these guys were fishermen because they weren't smart enough to be a disciple of any of the other religious leaders. In fact, every Jewish boy had to learn their scripture, which is our Old Testament. They had to memorize the whole thing, or at least attempt to. And if they weren't good enough, then they didn't get picked to follow a rabbi. And so most people weren't good enough. And so it was an honor to be called to follow a religious leader. So when Jesus comes, and I imagine he had a little bit of a reputation by this point. People had started to hear him teach a little bit, and Jesus says, "Hey, why don't you follow me?" Well, that combined with the miracle that he did, they were like, "Okay, well, we'll follow him." They probably had an idea of what it looked like because they'd seen other disciples follow other rabbis and religious leaders, but they had no idea what they were getting into when they first said yes to following Jesus. It was one baby step at a time. Basically, what Jesus is saying, and what any leader is saying when they ask somebody to follow them, is come, follow me, watch what I do, see behind the scenes how I treat people when I'm not teaching, see what I do, and then do what I do. And that's basically it. So they probably, thought, okay, we'll follow him and watch the way he lives his life, and then we'll be just as good as him, and we'll start following him. But what Jesus didn't require of them was he didn't have them pass a Bible test. He didn't ask them if they were religious. He didn't ask around to find out how their behavior was, to see if they were worthy of following him. And he didn't tell them that they were going to be better people or that their life was going to be better by following him. He just simply invited them. Jesus invited them to go where he was so that they could be more like him. And to them, this was a great honor. This was awesome, but they had no idea what they were getting into. Now, over the next 3.5 years, you know what they saw? They saw Jesus heal blind people, lame people, feed 5,000 people on more than one occasion. He saw Jesus raise people from the dead. He raised a middle school girl from the dead. He raised Lazarus from the dead. And eventually they saw Jesus raise himself from the dead. And then they get to see him do all these powerful things. And not only did they get to witness all that, but Peter, who was called Simon, he was one of the brothers there, eventually becomes the very first leader of the church after Jesus ascends back into heaven. He goes, okay, I'm sending you my Holy Spirit. He's going to live inside of you. He's going to teach and convict you. And he's going to do all the things, and it's going to be awesome. It's going to be better than if I were here with you. He goes, and he's like, I'll come back. Don't worry. I'll be back one day. And I imagine the early church kept waiting for Jesus to come back and didn't realize that God's time isn't the same as ours. But Peter eventually becomes this first leader of the church. And then, other than John, who's also one of Jesus' closest disciples, every one of his closest disciples, every one of them, they died as martyrs, defending their faith and their love for Jesus. They died with conviction. Thousands of years later, we're still looking at these stories. We're still preaching about them. We're still talking about them. We're still applying the lessons we learned from Jesus, and he's still changing hearts and minds today. Now, this is stuff that they had no idea was happening. When Jesus asked for them to follow, they had no idea what they were getting into. And in fact, God had a life in mind for them that was bigger than the one they were currently living. So if they had said no to following Jesus, or if Jesus hadn't even called them, they would have just fished. They would have done that for the rest of their days. They probably just would have lived boring fisherman lives. But because they decided to follow Jesus, the whole trajectory of their life changed for them and their family. And Jesus had more in mind for their lives in the areas that mattered most. Most of us, when we decide to follow Jesus, sometimes there's things that we feel like we're owed and promised because of our decision to follow Jesus. And most of the times, Jesus has more in mind for our lives in the areas that matter most. In other words, we think, and there's preachers that have preached, that God will bless you if you give to the church. And you will have financial blessings for giving to the church. And it's called prosperity gospel. They'll basically say, if you give, then God will give to you. And it's this like bait and switch, and they promise a better life for following Jesus because God wants you to be happy. That's the prosperity gospel. And it's not the real gospel. And so most people, a lot of people, when they start to follow Jesus, it's because they think that God is going to make their life better in some way, and he does. But what ends up actually happening is God takes the parts of your lives that actually matter most, the ones that you don't always think of, and he makes them way better than you ever could have imagined. Your relationships are stronger, which are the things that really matter in life. Right? Your work ethic is stronger and better. You're able to have fulfillment and satisfaction even when you have no reason to be happy. In fact, sometimes some of the most joyful, there's the word, some of the most joyful people that I know are people that are going through like the suckiest time. People who have had death, people who have had like loss of a job or financial hardship, people who have had like literally the worst things happen, cancer, and they have no reason to be happy or joyful, but they're the most joyful people I know. And it's because they don't find their satisfaction in those things. They find their satisfaction, their fulfillment, through their relationship with Jesus and the relationship with those around them. And by following Jesus, we're able to walk in the same footsteps. In fact, Jesus teaches, and what we find as we begin to follow him and as we have spent years following him and we can look back on our lives, what we find is that when you really understand who Jesus is, it changes everything. He was not just a prophet. He was not just a really good teacher. He didn't just have some good things to say. He wasn't just a miracle worker. He's the person that changes everything. And he's changed the course of the entire world ever since being here. Some of the best things socially that have happened in our world, things like orphanages and hospitals, are because of the church, people who follow Jesus. Did you know back in Roman times, back when Jesus walked the earth, it was common, they didn't have abortions in the sense that we have them today with our modern technology. That's long, anyway. But what they did do was, if they couldn't financially support another baby or they had an unwanted kid, what they would do is they'd take them out to the street and leave them. It's called exposure. And if somebody would pick them up and give them a chance to live, they could, but if not, the babies died. And that was common in that world. Okay? But it was Christians that said, no, that is unjust. That is not right. And Christians built the first orphanages and started taking care of the rejected the way that Jesus looked after and took care of the rejected. And there's story after story after story of different things that Christianity has influenced in our world today that we look at and we think, man, how did the world ever exist without these things? How did barbarians live without these kinds of things? And it's oftentimes traced back to what the early Christians started. Because the church, when you understand who Jesus really is, changes everything. And not only for society as a whole, but for your own life. Kind of as I mentioned, it gives you satisfaction. In fact, it can give you satisfaction so much that when you don't have all the answers to your biggest questions, your trust in God is enough. It's not naive, but it's a faith that you are okay not having all the answers. And for me, that's really difficult because I'm very analytical and I like to have all the answers. But I'm okay not knowing everything because I know that maybe either when I get to heaven, I'll find the answer, or I know ultimately God's the one in control and he knows what he's doing. And my job is to keep doing what I can and following him one baby step at a time, just like his earliest disciples. So For us, what I'd encourage you guys to do as we start the series is to start reimagining what following Jesus looks like. A lot of times, especially in the American church, our view of God becomes so small. It's like he lives in a box that is only capable of these things, and Christians look this way. And we don't ever really think outside of that or give God the opportunity to show up in our lives in big ways. So start reimagining what Jesus looks like. Secondly, take a step. For Peter and Andrew, their step was to get out of the boat, drop their nets, and follow Jesus. For you, it might be something else. It's probably something else because I don't think any of you are fishermen unless you're doing it for fun, right? But stop what you're doing and think, what would it look like to take a step towards Jesus? Maybe that's actually downloading the Bible app on your phone and reading from it. Maybe that is having a conversation with somebody about spirituality or about faith that maybe you haven't had before. I don't know what it is for you, but think about taking a step, and your small group leaders can help you think of some of those things if you can't. Number 3 is think about these 3 questions, okay? Because these questions are the questions that we're really going to be digging in deep over the next 3 weeks. And our answers to these questions will change the entire trajectory of how we think and how we live. First question is, who am I? Okay, this is about identity. At your core, who are you? Our identity is made up of a lot of things. You guys got a lot of stuff in your life. You got a lot of authority figures speaking into your life. You've got a lot of places you could go for answers that are trying to tell you who you are and how your life should look. So who am I? Where do I fit in? The question of belonging. Everybody wants to fit in, but not everybody knows where that is. And where do the different components of your identity fit in with your life? Number 3, can I make a difference? This has to do with purpose and meaning and fulfillment. Who am I? Where do I fit in? And can I make a difference? The 3 questions that everybody asks, even into adulthood. And when people don't have good answers to this is where they often have midlife crises, or a lot of peers of mine have had quarter-life crises, and it's actually way more common than you would think. Oftentimes people will get out of college and start to go into their vocation and then realize, I don't want to do this at all. What have I done with my life? I've spent tens of thousands of dollars at college, and I don't like what I have to do because everything that I thought this job was going to be is really that's only like 10% of the job, and 90% of it is stuff I hate. Or people work their whole careers to a certain point. Maybe they even achieve their goals. And there's countless stories of people who have the Super Bowl ring, who have won and achieved their greatest achievement in life and then still find themselves unfulfilled because their purpose and can I make a difference, that question wasn't answered. And so these are the questions that everybody asks, whether it's conscious or subconsciously. And it's pretty important that we have good answers for these questions. So we're going to be diving into those for the next few weeks, and even questions that maybe are less big in scope, questions that maybe you have other questions about faith that are like, okay, well, what about the Bible? Because you're reading from that a lot. So how do we know that is the ultimate authority, and how do we know it's not full of contradictions, and how do we know X, Y, and Z? Maybe you have questions legitimately about that and the role it has in your faith. Maybe you have other questions like who's allowed in, who does belong, just like Paul wrestled with the Jews and the Gentiles, who belongs in Christianity and who doesn't. What do you have to do and not do in order to be accepted? And maybe you have other questions along those lines about just faith and Christianity in general. And if you do, then great. I'm going to answer those questions and not only give you my limited answer to those things, but I'm also going to point you to resources where you can dig deeper and find those answers yourself, should you choose to. But I'm not going to know your questions unless you put them in the jar over there. So if you, right where you walked in, we said something in the video, and you may have passed it when you walked in, because I know it's crazy when we first get here. But at some point tonight, if you think of a question that you're like, I never hear people talk about this, but it's a legitimate question I have, put it in there. You can leave it anonymous. I won't know who's asking it. I don't know your handwriting. Nobody writes anymore. So just put in your question, and on our YouTube channel, it's Victory Student Ministry, I'm going to be answering those questions. So you'll have it in video format where you can refer back to it and see if it makes sense or not, and check resources in the description, all that kind of stuff. So it'll be really helpful for you, but it'll only be as helpful as you make it. So if you have questions, put them in there. And you can put multiple questions in there. You don't just have to put one. So this is going to be a really rich series where we're going to dive into a lot of really important issues, some controversial issues, some issues that a lot of people don't think about until they're forced to, and we want to get you guys thinking about those things before you're forced to because of life circumstances. And so that's really where we're headed with these series, is we're going to, in these conversations, answer these broad questions as it relates to life and faith and Christianity and the big picture, and what does that actually mean. And then also in other forms of content and within your small groups, we're going to be answering those other questions that you guys have and stuff like that. So groups are a safe place where you're free of judgment and you can be yourself, you can ask questions. Odds are somebody else in the group is thinking about it and they're just not saying it. Or you can just, ask for prayer requests. We're here literally just to encourage one another and build one another up. So groups also are as good as you make them. So if you don't really contribute a whole lot, it probably will just be iffy for you. But if you are a part of things and you make an effort, then it'll be worth your while because you're going to be building lifelong relationships that are centered around Jesus. And that's really important. So Jesus has more in mind for our lives in the areas that matter most. And all it takes on our part is some faith to follow him one step at a time. So I'm going to pray. We'll be dismissed into our small groups, and then we're going to be done for the evening. So thank you guys for being here. Let me pray.